Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, good to be here. So today we're going to be learning from the UK abolition of human slavery. And so why learn from slavery, the human abolition of slavery? So yeah, as Natalie mentioned, it's often seen as the closest historical parallel to the animal freedom movement. So both involve the fight against property status, exploitation, and the othering of individuals. I also think it's just very interesting as a movement, and I think there's a lot of really rich history and a lot of things we can learn from them. Um, but there's also some important distinctions. It was its own movement, it took place within its own context, and we've got to be wary of that when we're applying it to our movement. So the purpose of the presentation is just to give you a sort of a dip into the history of this movement, and provide you with some key takeaways and lessons that we can strengthen our own movement with. And I just want to start with this quote by Olaudah Equiano, who was a former slave writer and co-founder of the Sons of Africa, one of the advocacy groups at the time. And I think this uh, sort of idea of liberty is what really connects both our movements. And so I just want to start with that quote from him. So here's the contents of the presentation or the webinar. So we'll start with just a brief history of slavery in the UK, very brief, and then we'll go into the history of the UK abolitionist movement. We'll then look at some key similarities and some key differences, and then we'll end with some key takeaways. It will just be key takeaways because there is so much we could learn from this, but obviously time is limited. So a brief history of slavery in the UK. So it existed pre-Roman times. It was a fact of life. Tribes, societies regularly enslaved one another. Became institutionalized by the Roman conquest of 43 AD because they loved to enslave everyone. It transformed into serfdom with the 1066 conquest by William the Conqueror. And about 12th century AD, slavery as we exist didn't really, slavery as we know didn't really exist, although serfdom was not much better. So yeah, here we have the Atlantic slave trade in the late 1700s. So I'm pretty sure most people would be familiar with this. But how it worked is sort of goods from Europe would come to the coast of Africa. They would then, through kingdoms and slave hunters, would then give the traders slaves. Slaves would be taken over to the West Indies, plantation states, Guyana, etc., in exchange for tobacco, cotton, sugar, taken back to Europe to sell or to put into industry and whatever. So that's how the trade worked. The first trade of slaves in the UK was generally established to be Sir John Hawkins in the 1550s, who was commissioned by Elizabeth I to do this. And this sort of coincides with the beginnings or the nascent British Empire in its early history. And there were various justifications and reasons for slavery and the British participation in the Atlantic slave trade. So one is obviously racist justifications that Black people were inferior to whites or more naturally suited to slavery. The growth of the British Empire demanded trade of cotton, sugar, tobacco, and other valuable goods. So there's an economic argument. There's also arguments that Africa, because some kingdoms would enslave people, or they'd raid other kingdoms to enslave people, they sold their own people into slavery, and therefore slavery is okay for the British to participate in. And there was also a religious angle. So it was an opportunity to civilize and bring slaves into Christianity, good for their souls. And the Church of England, incidentally, or not so incidentally, was also heavily involved in slavery. So there are a lot of different justifications and motivating reasons for slavery. And at the time of the 1700s, it accounted for about 11% of the British Empire's economy. So yeah, quite a significant chunk of their economy was dependent on slavery. So the UK abolitionist history. So what a lot of people sort of it's not wrong to say the movement really grew in the late 1700s, but it had a much longer history than that. So back in the 1720s, you had the Quakers. So this is the Quaker relief symbol. They were the first sort of religious group or civil group to advocate against slavery in the UK. And the Baptist movement started to speak out against slavery in the 1750s as well, and later the Methodists too. And then you get to about the 1760s, 1770s, you saw the growth of freedom suits. So slaves would sue their masters for freedom. So the most notable case was James Somerset, and he was successfully freed from his bondage. And it set a legal precedent that you couldn't be a slave on English soil, though this didn't outlaw slavery, and slavery still persisted, but it was an important precedent to achieve. But the movement really grew with the foundation of the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade. So this is the shortest of their titles. They loved long titles back then. In 1787, as well as the Sons of Africa, led by Olaudah Equiano and Ottobah Cugoano. So this this was their emblem. It was very popular at the time, and I think it appealed to a lot of abolitionists because there's a current of common humanity, but also the slave is kneeling in Christian supplication. There's sort of this racial overtone of white people granting slaves their freedom, but it spoke to their society at the time. But now I would consider it very outdated and racist. But at the time, that was the symbol that really caught a lot of people's imagination. And the movement can be seen as two phases. One is the abolition of the slave trade, which was from 1787 really to 1807. And then the second phase is from 1823 to 1833, and we'll get to that a bit later, so the first part was just abolishing the slave trade, and then just the traffic of slaves in the triangle. And then the latter part was the abolition of slavery itself as an institution. So what did the society do? So they were really important pioneers of specific tools we all use today. So it's comprised mostly of Quakers, but they recruited Thomas Clarkson and Granville Sharp and one other person, I can't remember his name, because they were Anglicans and they would be respected in British society. The Quakers were kind of seen as these weird, radical, odd group, and they were a very small minority in Britain at the time. So they strategically chose 2 people or 3 people to represent them publicly, which I thought was quite clever, who would have more purchase with British society. So the reason they targeted the slave trade first and not slavery as a whole is because they thought it was more achievable. This is because property rights were really important under English law, so challenging that would be quite a blow. And they also thought that if we abolish the slave trade, I think they said it would wither on the vine the institution of slavery, because there was no more slave trading, the slave populations couldn't sustain themselves. So they thought by abolishing the slave trade, it would lead to the abolition of slavery entirely. So what were some key strategies? So Thomas Clarkson here went around the country setting up networks of local groups. There was grassroots organizing. They arranged lectures, petitions to sign to Parliament. They got witnesses for Parliament, for parliamentary inquiries. And this was really important in mobilizing public opinion and creating pressure on politicians to act against slavery. So petitions, for instance, they used to be just this thing of the upper class. You know, it would be some merchant or some upper class gentleman coming to Parliament presenting a petition, whereas what they did was they really almost democratized it in a way, is that they got like thousands of signatures just from everyday working people and across society. So for that, for the time, it was actually quite a big thing to get petitions of this nature signed and presented to Parliament. They also, with this chap here, William Wilberforce, who's probably one of the most well-known figures from this history, a lot of political lobbying. He was a member of the upper class. He was able to leverage the connections with MPs, and he consistently, like year after year, presented bills to abolish the slave trade in Parliament. It was just constantly, they just did not let up. I think the only time when they didn't submit it is where he was ill, and I think even then they got other people to submit it. So there's a lot of political lobbying and sort of dallying around in the upper class at that time. And then you also had winning hearts and minds. So they enlisted poets to write poems. They produced essays, which were widely read in coffee shops, which at the time were these hotbeds of debate. Olidar Equiano published a biography in 1789, which was a massive hit because it showed um, it showed the experience, the lived experience of an ex-slave, which was very unusual for British society at the time. And there was sort of a rational belief that if we show people the horrors of slavery, sorry, then people would turn against it. But they did also make appeals to empathy, and they used media in a very creative way at the time. So one way they use media is this description of the slave ship. This is similar to a drawing or by Thomas Clarkson, but it's not the actual one. And they showed this to a lot of politicians and influential figures. So Thomas Clarkson showed this to the Tsar of Russia at the time, and he was horrified by it. And for the audience in 1700s Britain, this was like shocking that we were doing this to so many people. So it's really, this was actually quite shocking to them. Whereas I guess now it wouldn't be as shocking. They also, even though the society didn't weren't the people to launch the campaigns, they did participate in the sugar boycott campaigns, which first started in 1791. And the sugar boycott campaigns were really important because they allowed women who controlled the food of the household, they were the household keepers, to get involved in the movement. Whereas it was very difficult, at that period of time for women to be active in civil society in the same way men were. So a lot of women were instrumental in aiding the sugar boycott to become popular. Another reason why the sugar boycott was important was they boycotted sugar from the West Indies, and it made slavery visible in a way that wasn't. So when people realized, sugar is from the slaves, it was like they wanted to stop using it. And it made slavery visible in a way that it wasn't before. But they didn't stop using other slave products. They focused on sugar. The British slave trade was ultimately abolished in 1807 after years of campaigning, but there was also they had built up a large amount of sympathetic MPs in Parliament who would vote against abolition, and they had also built up a lot of public support for abolishing the slave trade. But there was also geopolitical context as well that helped the slave trade be banned. So one was Napoleon had reinstated slavery after the French Revolution had ended it. And so the British were like, we want to screw the French, let's end the slave trade. So to show a bit of moral superiority. And they also had a new prime minister who was a bit more favorable to abolition. And Haiti was the first country of a former slave colony of France, which was a massive sugar producer. And so Haiti had fought for their independence over, I think, about 10 years. I think it was like 1793 to 1804. Don't quote me on that, maybe a bit longer. But they were a massive sugar producer. And when they became independent, France could no longer compete with the UK on sugar. So the sugar plantations and the planters were not as threatened by ending the slave trade because France was no longer a competitor in that regard, and especially after the Napoleonic Wars ended, that sort of argument that France would outdo us if we ended the slave trade went away. So these were just a few of the reasons. There were a lot more, but just to give you an idea. And so when the slave trade was ended in 1807, there was very little action until the 1820s. So there was some what we could call welfare reforms around this time. There was some efforts to by some institutions to ensure and promote slave-free commerce with Africa. But they for the reforms didn't really work because they weren't enforced and they were left in the hands of colonial authorities. And these reforms to slavery um, didn't really weren't really leading to the end of slavery. And the what was I going to say? It's important, it'll come back to me. So the abolitionists were like, it's not working, we need to do something differently. So we had this reform. And so they restated the Society to End Slavery in 1823. And so they sort of did a lot of the same activities. They campaigned with lectures, they did public demonstrations, they canvassed people for support to end slavery. They even at one point listed MPs by their sympathy or willingness to pass abolition. Now, there's not as much on like the sort of tactics and strategy around this time. It's actually much more, you get more information from the abolition of the slave trade. But there were splinters and there were disagreements within the anti-slavery movement at that time. And we'll just go into that a little bit. Before it was finally abolished in 1833. And I'll sort of look at the process of how that came about as much as we can. So something that doesn't get talked about a lot is that women were really important in ending slavery at this time, even though they weren't, they weren't as involved in ending the slave trade, but they were really involved in ending slavery. So they did, first of all, this was like they redid the Wedgwood medallion. Now it was, am I not a woman and a sister instead of am I not a man and a brother? And there was about 70 women abolition groups, and they sort of kept the abolition movement alive during the 1820s. And especially Elizabeth Hyrick was a leading voice for immediate abolition, not gradual. And they formed, and there was some immediate, there was this schism between the immediate versus gradual. The gradual abolitionists were sort of the William Wilberforces and the Thomas Clarksons, and they were sort of the old guard, and the younger and the women were more looking for immediate abolition because they saw it as such a moral crisis, and they didn't see that the reforms were really making any tangible difference. Although I would argue that the reforms could have made a tangible difference, they just weren't enforced very well. But there was a schism between the immediate and the gradual abolitionists. And the women groups were generally more radical than the men. They stopped buying any products using West Indian sugar, and they withheld donations from the Anti-Slavery Society until they relinquished gradualism. And gradualism was abandoned by 1830 as due to the previous reforms not really working, and the whole society did move to immediate emancipation at that point. But there were a few events which sort of, and we'll get onto them later about, there were a few events that sort of made the case for immediate rather than gradual abolition. So one pivotal event, there were many rebellions against slavery, and there was a rebellion in 1823, the Demerara Rebellion in Guyana, which was really important. But there was also the Sam Sharp Rebellion in Jamaica in 1831. And these sort of made the argument that slavery could not be sustained. Slavery was just going to keep, people did not want to be enslaved. They were just going to keep rebelling and killing white people. But this one was particularly important because it's also called the Baptist War. And the Baptists in Jamaica, there were missionaries, and the missionaries were attacked by planters. I don't know, none of them were killed, but they were like assaulted, and they were driven out of Jamaica in the aftermath of this rebellion because the planters blamed the missionaries for the rebellion. When the missionaries went back to the UK and they started talking about the planters being, assaulting them, the British public were outraged. They couldn't believe these men of God had been assaulted by these planters, and the planters were seen as these gentlemen. It was these gentlemen planters, that was the view of the planters, and this sort of tarnished their image. And the public were much more outraged over the men of God being assaulted than they were the hundreds of dead slaves that were killed during and after the uprising, which I think, even though they had tried to create some empathy with enslaved people, there was still, it's at the end of the day, it was, still a white-centric society. Um, so, but abolition ultimately rode on a wave of reform. At this time, there was, due to the Industrial Revolution, there'd been much more focus on the rights of workers, the rights of children. There was prison reform. There was this greater push for, there's this push for reform in the 1830s. And particularly important was the removal of rotten boroughs. So these were parliamentary constituencies where you'd have MPs who would only represent like 40 people, and it was just completely undemocratic. So they got rid of these during the reform movement. And it just so happened that loads of these parliamentary constituencies were represented by slave owners. So once you got rid of them, the power of the slavery lobby was substantially decreased. So there was less MPs to oppose abolition, and they sort of realized where the wind was turning. It was the public outrage over the Samshar Rebellion, along with the reform, was just the public wanted abolition, and all the advocacy and pressure from the people. So it was ultimately a compromise, and they paid off the slave owners to allow abolition to happen. And we only stopped paying the debt. I think I could be very wrong about this, but I think it was like 2018. So the money we paid to allow the slave owners to for their loss of property was only paid off in the debt we had to them in the 2018 or 2010s. So just give you an idea of how much money we gave to them. But it did enable slavery to end in the British Empire, but not entirely, and we'll get back to that in a bit later. So that's kind of the history. There's a lot of history. I hope that wasn't too much. I know it's very, it's a big movement, and there's a lot going on. But I just want to go into some sort of what are some key similarities. When we're looking at our movement versus the anti-slavery movement or the abolition movement. Excuse me. So as I said earlier, just take a drink of water. So as I said earlier, targeting property status is one of them. That's you get a given. They're both trying to stop the enslavement of humans, of animals. We're an allied movement. They were an allied movement. You had some ex-slaves like Oladar who were able to represent the lived experience of enslaved people, but it was mostly comprised of middle to upper class gentlemen and women, though they did organize and gain support amongst, across class. And we are also a allied movement. And I think that's, but there is a case to be argued, and I'll make that later, that on the next few slides, that the slaves who rebelled were also part of the movement. And yeah, just like us, there's this who have the welfare versus abolitionism. So too did they have their schism between the gradual and the immediate abolitionists. So it mirrors our own debate. Some more key similarities. This fine young chap was Banastre Tarleton, who was a pro-slavery advocate, one of the most prominent in the British Parliament. So just like then, we have powerful lobbies and people with vested interests in stopping animal exploitation. So too did they have very powerful interests trying to stop the abolition of slavery. So British merchants would threaten to take business elsewhere if the slave trade was abolished. There was humane washing. So slaves, they said, slaves rejoiced to fall into slavers' hands. They weren't flogged as hard as schoolboys were. The West India lobby in particular outspent abolitionists by a large degree. very similar to the lobbies we're facing today. Um, Visibility, yeah, I mentioned this before. So just like our movement, animal exploitation or the treatment of slaves was very much hidden from everyday people's views, and I think that's the same here. Whether it's factory farms or animal testing, it's sort of hidden away, and we're trying to bring light to it. And the sugar boycott, for instance, was one of those things, one of those actions trying to bring light to hidden injustice. And just like the movement, we also trade or use the narrative of suffering, I should say, to create empathy and concern for the plight of animals. But there are some key differences. So faith was a huge driving force. Most or nearly all the population at the time was Christian. We don't really have that same binding ideology now. It's more political. So like, what could be our binding ideology? How the faith was meeting people's needs. It was meeting this need for like Christian virtue. It was meeting this need for uh, feeling like the patriotism as well. Is meeting the need for patriotism, abolishing slavery. So for me, it's always how can we meet the society's needs in our own activism, in our own advocacy. There was also the utility of violence, in our movement. Well, debate about what we mean by violence, but in terms of like armed rebellion, I think for our movement, it's violence has turned a lot of people against animal activists, whereas in the anti-slavery movement, violence was actually very essential. If you didn't have these rebellions, you probably wouldn't have had the abolition of slavery come about as soon as it did, relatively speaking. And also, if you didn't defeat France in the Napoleonic Wars, you wouldn't have taken away the argument that we needed to compete with France. So violence was actually really important, even though the movement itself was non-violent. The strategists in the UK, violence was really important to slavery being abolished. And at the same time, petitions, boycotts, these were new tools of civic society. Boycotts, for instance, they're derived, the word boycott, maybe people know this, is that it's derived from Captain Boycott, a landlord in Ireland in the 1880s, who employees withdrew their labor to protest evictions. So, but the movement had already started doing boycotts, 100 years before then. So, but the thing is now these tools are petitions, boycotts, demonstrations, they're all very well known. Politicians get 100 petitions a day, so it's the novelty of the time was really effective. So it's like, what tools do we have? How can we use them? Is a question. There's also the speciesism barrier. So although there was dehumanization and racism towards slaves and Black people generally, there were less barriers to empathy. So there were Black people who were military veterans, ex-slaves like Olada could speak about the horrors of slavery. There was even naval impressment in the UK. So this was forcibly recruiting sailors, and they would have gangs who would go around the coasts of the UK, and they would forcibly recruit them to just get the British to sustain the British Empire to get them in the Navy. And the Navy was terrible. You did not want to be in it. It had really strict discipline and terrible food. And one way they just abducted people sometimes. They just straight up kidnapped you. The other times they would, you'd be in a bar, they would drop a shilling in your drink or give it to you. And then once you drink it and the shilling's at the bottom, you take in the king's shilling, and therefore you're in the Navy. So people in the UK, especially around the port regions, kind of had an experience, not the same as slavery, but they understood the arbitrariness and the sort of being taken away from your home at a moment's notice because they were forcibly recruited into the British Navy. And there was also just the geopolitical and social context. And I'll just go on to the next slide just to tell you, because I think when you're looking at this movement, sometimes you can be like, well, of course it was going to happen. With hindsight, it's very obvious that it was going to happen. But, you know, you had the reform movement, naval impressment, you had the Haitian Revolution, but there was also the rise of the British Pax Britannica, so the British peace, when Britain became the predominant world power during the 1800s. There was less global power conflict, less threat to Britain's status, and also the rise of India was the West Indies became increasingly not unprofitable, but less profitable than the East India Company, and they still had slaves, but they used wage laborers as well. And Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations in the late 1700s, and this was the sort of versionings of modern capitalist. Not the version. It was an important part of free trade and sort of capitalist ideology that if you pay people for labor, they're more productive. And so these ideas are also taking hold. And so the idea of using slaves was seen as less efficient and also contributed to slavery being, able to be abolished. So yeah, let's have a look at some lessons then. So having looked at those similarities and differences. So one thing is using the inside and the outside game. So the inside game is the sort of working within established systems and institutions to influence policy, legislation. And it's sort of, you have access to power or you're working with important institutions. So for the slave trade, for instance, William Wilberforce was working with he was working with politicians and the key decision makers. And then you had the outside game, which is like focused on grassroots activism and public mobilization to create pressure on those power structures. And they used this so effectively in this movement because Thomas Clarkson was this outside agitator. And you had William Wilberforce, who was part of the upper class elite, and it was yin and yang. It was just complementing each other. He'd put pressure on there. You know, William Wilberforce would leverage it in Parliament, and then so on and so forth. And it was just, yeah, really effectively well done. And I think for our movement, we don't really see this sort of leveraging the inside and outside games effectively, in my opinion, or we've got people doing both, but there's not as much communication. And I think we could be a lot more effective and powerful. Like, so could we be more effective and powerful if we were sort of doing this inside and outside game work? Yeah, ecosystem approach. So the movement, you know, even though it was ultimately political goals each time to end the slave trade, to end slavery, they used a lot of different strategies. And you had, you know, I mentioned these winning hearts and minds, lobbying, organizing before, but they also had legal precedents. They even created a alternative colony in Sierra Leone. And so they were really pushing for loads of different ways of making change that added up to the sum of its parts. And it didn't matter that there were disagreements between these, you know, the different theory of change, but they were all working towards one goal. And I think this is what we need to consider in our movement, is that all these theory of changes, or sorry, all these ways of making change, I should say, are really important. And so even if we've got people doing individual consumer change or political change or systems change, these are all part of the same movement, and they can collaborate and work together like they did here. And like even in the initial committee, you know, there were disagreements between people as well. Like Wilberforce was really conservative, Granville Sharp felt Quakers were too radical, Clarkson was very radical, more radical. He was sympathetic to the French Revolution, went over there and visited them, but they didn't let those divides get in the way of getting stuff done. And if they had just kept in their lanes, they would not have been as effective. And like, even though gradualism was abandoned in the movement by 1830 as well, like the banning of the slave trade could be seen as a well-formed step, but it was a really important first step to ban the trade before banning slavery. So yeah, it's different ways of making change can coexist with one another, even if there's disagreements. Yeah, the importance of trusted messengers. So a trusted messenger is someone who has he has the eyes or they have the eyes and ears of um, the people in their circle, right? So that's what I mean by trusted messengers. They're trusted by their circle of peers. And so during the Haiti Revolution, the British actually fought in Haiti, and military officers came back impressed with the slaves' ability to fight, and they later became anti-slavery advocates because they were like, well, they can fight. Look at this, they're really good at fighting. We like fighting too, and so it was important that people of the upper crust, shall we say, heard it from people like them about slavery and why to oppose it. And Equiano as well, he embodied this British sense of hard work, industriousness. It was a sort of rising above his station almost. And so when he came with his autobiography, British people could see that and it sort of spoke to them. So it's like, who are the trusted messages in our movement and how can we recruit them? Like vegans support the farmers by Animal Rising in the UK, I think does a fantastic job because they're the kind of people we can get on side if we have the right messaging and the right campaigns, and we can go beyond the usual activist perception. And it's also important to note that when anti-slavery advocacy first started, they were seen as complete loons. They were seen as radical, out of touch idiots. Didn't understand the plantations was one of the arguments. Didn't understand like plantation life. So it's the same sort of arguments that we face. This is a little bit, I'm going to contradict myself a little because the next slide sort of contradicts this, but in a way, but we only need people to care enough to make change or to make the change we need. And by this, I mean, we don't need everyone to buy into our entire vision in order to make tangible gains. So religious duty, sympathy, outrage, rather than the idea of racial and political equality motivated people to take action. I've mentioned the Samshal Rebellion and uh, the the missionaries who came back, but William Wilberforce, for example, he's lauded as the person, one of the key people who ended slavery. When William Wilberforce had dinners and he had black people over, he would have a screen up between the white people and the black people because they weren't equal to the white people, and that's even after doing all this anti-slavery advocacy. So he didn't believe in the idea of racial and political equality, yet he still fought for the abolition of slavery. So for me, it's like, what are the steps we need to get people to? Like, what's the bare minimum just to get them across that line for the next thing, and then the next thing, and then the next thing. We don't need everyone to agree with our vision straight away, or agree with with our whole agenda. Um, yeah, keep the pressure going. So this is the final slide. Um, So yeah, the abolitionists thought that ending the slave trade would end slavery, so it didn't. Um, they weren't wrong to target the slave trade. The problem is they sort of wipe their hands on like, okay, it's all good now. We've done the slave trade. They did, no one's gonna, people aren't gonna be people and have relationships and grow populations, and they didn't think that they didn't look past it. They didn't advocate more from that. They were just sort of content and they didn't follow up with any more advocacy and more activism. And so they needed to keep going and they didn't keep going, and I think that's the problem with this, with when that's a key weakness of the movement, is that they didn't follow up. They could have ended slavery sooner, I think, if they'd followed up after the end of the slave trade. But even after the abolition of the slave trade, like, or slavery, like, you've got this idea here, like this photo, this picture just really rankles me because you've got this idea of these sort of white men freeing the slaves and how heroic they are, and it's like, okay, they did they did abolish slavery, but there was still a grace period until 1838 where slaves were apprentices, still slaves, to enable the transition. And slavery still existed in parts of the empire, like India, and they still continued to profit from slaves' goods. And it wasn't until 100 plus years later that you actually started to get what I would call full political and economic equality under law in the UK. And even now, Black Lives Matter, there is still a lot more work to be done. So so people look at the movement, I think sometimes and think, oh wow, 1787 to 1833, they did this huge change. Yes, they did do a huge change and it was really important, but that wasn't the end of the story. Then there's still work to be done. And it's sort of, how do you then judge a movement by its success? Is it generational success? Is it just that specific time? I think you've got to look at it, you've got to have a wider long-term view of movements. And for our movement, it's, we need to get people on those steps, but we also need to make sure the change, in my view, is institutionalized for times to come. Okay, there are more lessons that I did have, but in the interest of time, I wanted to stop there. These are the sources I used. Yeah, I'd especially recommend Bury the Chains and the report from, this was from the Sentience Institute. I didn't actually put the name, but sorry. Yeah, the report here was really useful. Yeah.